And hopefully between Nick and I, we're going to give you a good sense of patterns in behaviour, walking behaviour. Hazel's been challenging Martin, who does a lot of our analysis, to kind of get into frequency a little bit. So I'm going to try and bring that to life a little bit. And then some of Nick's slides build on what I'm going to articulate really quite nicely. And it should hopefully leave us, after we've had this bit of input, with some really interesting questions to try and throw around between us as to what's going on and what can we learn from that and what does that mean for the kind of action that we need to take. So hopefully it should hopefully fit together quite well. I'm going to start with the challenge that Martin had around, my colleague Martin had around frequency and how do you look at walking behaviour when you've got this massive data set from active lives. And we did a set of slides which I think are available somewhere where we focused on this measure in the middle, 2 sessions of moderate intensity activity. Both of those sessions had to be longer than 10 minutes, and the 2 sessions had to add up to more of an hour. And this is a Sport England measure that they use for different sports and activities. And we sat and we've done this really nice slide deck looking at that kind of behaviour and the differences in it. And I've got a couple of slides about it, but it doesn't feel right, does it? Like, have you walked for more than 10 minutes and over an hour in the last month? It doesn't feel like it's enough for us to be taking kind of decisions around walking behaviour. We also had a look at any walking, but this is any walking. If you've done a minute of it, it's in there. What I got struck by with that, though, was 14% of the population aren't doing any walking at all. What's going on there? But it's also, when you tried to unpick it, it was quite clumsy and it didn't really kind of show a lot. So we kind of threw that out the window and thought we'll go somewhere else. And then Hazel's saying to Martin, I want more on frequency. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to just show you a couple of slides that follow that middle group, that middle behaviour of twice in the last 28 days that adds up to an hour, and it's sessions over 10 minutes. But then I'm going to follow a bit more around inactive walkers, and what does that tell us? And actually we've started to break this group of walkers down into different kinds of frequency, and we've grouped them a little bit, and I'll explain that in a minute. But we should get into some nice detail, hopefully. As you know, well, you may not know, but Active Lives collects data around walking for leisure. So you're going out for a walk in the countryside, or you're just going to have a walk down the park, and your purpose is for health or leisure or relaxation or whatever it might be, or for walking for travel. And we can split the data for those 2 different types of walking. And as you can see, pre-pandemic, so you've got the 6 years of data that we've got it for, walking for leisure on the left-hand side. Remember, we're talking about twice in the last 28 days. We will share these slides so you can have a copy of them. You can see it was improving levels, the proportion that we're achieving twice in the last 28 days was improving before the pandemic in terms of walking for leisure. And then the pandemic has come along and accelerated that improvement. I think we'd all anecdotally kind of observed that, won't we? And those lockdowns came in. What could you do? Get out for a walk, come on kids, get out. So we had all of that going on. And then conversely, look what happened to walking for travel. And what's really interesting with that is, again, and this is the bit that I really want to get across, hope. Pre-pandemic, walking for travel rates were going up as well, which is really positive. But the pandemic has come in and shifted that really quite strikingly, which is quite interesting. So we had improving levels of walking for leisure and worsening levels of walking for travel. Just looking at that walking for leisure across all of the 10 localities of Greater Manchester, you can see that it pretty much improved. The black dot was kind of pre-pandemic year, and then the top of the blue tower is the latest year of data that we've got. And you can see that pretty much there was an improvement in all localities in terms of walking for leisure twice in the last 28 days. Some of them really saw huge improvements, which is really positive, and some a little bit smaller, but all of them, that growth that we've seen in walking for leisure is across all localities, which is really positive. But as I said, twice in the last 28 days just doesn't seem Doesn't seem a good way of kind of judging walking behaviour. So what has Martin done? Well, he's taken now the data and he's looked at the group of people, this inactive walkers, are doing. They're basically not doing any walks over 10 minutes. Okay, in a week, and that's done over the 28 days. So these people may be walking. Okay, they may be doing short walks, less than 10 minutes, but they're not getting over the 10-minute threshold. So there are going to be some walking minutes in here, but not a lot. Okay. Then you've got the next group up that are doing a couple of sessions, up to a couple of sessions a week. Then you've got these frequent walkers that are doing between 2 and 6 sessions per week. And then you've got this group that Martin's called regular walkers that are doing 7 or more sessions a week. We can't tell you that is daily walking, by the way, because the data isn't collected per day. We just know that top group have done more, 28 sessions or more of 10 minutes or more in the last month. Okay, it could be that they've done 2 or 3 on one day and nothing on another day. We can't use the data like that. So what we've done is basically go back through all of the demographics that we did, looking at kind of twice in the last 28 days, and just try and look at it through this lens, using these kind of groupings, so we can see what might be going on in terms of patterns across Greater Manchester and across our different demographic groups. I just want to show you this first, just to make that connection of how important walking is. Look at the left-hand side of this. Basically, those inactive walkers, so they're getting very few minutes from walking. Look how high inactivity is against the Chief Medical Officer's recommendation. 70% of that group are in the inactive group. It's not surprising, really, is it? Walking is the main activity. There are 22% of people that are getting minutes from elsewhere, but they don't walk. But they might be gardening, or they might be playing football, or whatever it might be. So some people that don't walk are getting minutes from somewhere else, but the vast majority of people that don't walk are not getting any minutes from anywhere else. And I've got a little bit more detail on that later when we start to look into some of the demographic groups. Okay, let's just look at the pattern now when we look at these 4 different groups over the years, so the trend over the 6 years of data. Again, start at the bottom with the inactive group, because that's where I'm going to focus most of my attention. Look at how that was improving. We want it to be going down. We want that proportion across the bottom to be reducing. Look at how it was reducing pre-pandemic. Really, really positive. And then the pandemic's come and boom, it's gone up. It's bounced back a little, but it's not bounced back quite as low as what it was pre-pandemic. So the pandemic has hit walking, but in a very nuanced way, which I will come to later. And again, look at the top. If we look at those regular walkers, there was a steady improvement, and actually that has bounced back. So that's good, but we've still got this large group of people down at the bottom that's a bit of a challenge. Just going into the demographic factors now. This really surprised me, by the way. I was gobsmacked at the order of these groups. Okay. On this, when we do inactivity, when we look at who's the most inactive in our community, it's almost certain that the group on the left-hand side, as in the most inactive, will be the over 75s because of age and frailty and so forth. So it's so common. 99 times out of 100, I would say, the tower on the left-hand side would be the over 75s. Look at where the over 75s are, and look at 3 groups that are actually worse than them. That's really intriguing. It could be the pandemic. We haven't gone back and looked at, well, there is a bit of trend stuff actually later, which we can maybe have a look at. But there's something not as we'd expect in these 3 groups on the left-hand side, where we've really got quite high levels of people that aren't getting over that 10-minute threshold, that might be doing some walking, but not doing anywhere near enough, really. And so a little bit later, I'm going to focus in on some of those groups in a little bit more detail with the data. Another factor, just breaking that ethnicity down that was on the last slide, it's not all diverse groups. It is the challenge is particularly greater amongst our Black and Asian communities. And you can see again how high there, and the other ethnic group as well, how high those inactive walk groups are within those communities. So the challenge is in parts of our more diverse community, not all of it. So again, we can start to think about how do we use the data to find those groups in our community, and I'll come back to that a little bit later, because there's something that going forward we might be able to do, but we certainly need to be thinking about our Black and Asian communities when we're thinking about walking behaviour. There's another factor as well which we need to be conscious of, which is unemployment. Okay, this doesn't surprise me, that this is a group that is very likely to experience higher levels of inactivity generally, and you can see just how high that shoots up. Obviously, that group, whilst it's spread across other socioeconomic groups, unemployment is generally higher in lower socioeconomic communities and more deprived communities. So there is definitely a connection here with kind of work, type, levels of qualifications, etc., etc. But you've got a range of groups there at a GM level population that we've got some thinking to do about what we can do to create a different behaviour. Just picking up on deprivation, I don't think this is a surprise, really, that the higher the level of deprivation, the higher the level of inactive walkers. That pattern is probably as we would expect it to be, sadly. So there is something about our more deprived communities that are diverse, that have got lower socioeconomic communities that are, have got higher rates of unemployment. We all know where they are, and we all know what about those communities generally. They tend to be more urban. They tend to be more densely populated. They tend to have less access to green space. They tend to have less green space in the communities. So there are some patterns here that I think we need to be thinking about in terms of how we go about planning and creating change and housing development in the future that can maybe try and think differently about the way that we shape communities. I'll hold my fire on that just yet. This is the thing that, going forward, I think we might be able to do some quite interesting work on. There's some really horrible terms for groups of people at the bottom. They're not ours. They come from the Office of National Statistics. This is their output area classification model. If you don't know what that is, probably good, because it's really geeky. But what the ONS do after the census is complete is they put the whole of the population in the, it's definitely Scotland, England and Wales, I don't know about Northern, I think it'll be UK, into 75 different little groups where you share characteristics. So I will probably be in a group, I don't know which one it'd be, but it would say something like, likely to live in semi-detached housing, likely to own one or more cars, likely to have children under the age of 16. You know, it gives you, at this 75 group level, it gives you some quite rich description of these little subgroups. Those subgroups add up to 25 groups, okay? Those 25 groups add up to 8 supergroups. Those are the 8 supergroups across the bottom. And we can get the data for those 8 supergroups. If you're wondering why I'm telling you this, why I'm trying to encourage you all to be really nerdy and geeky, is because we can follow these groups down to OA level, output area level. What does that mean? A pocket of geography that has less than 1,000 people in it. In some of the urban areas of Salford and Alderman, Rochdale and Manchester, we'll be talking a street, a couple of streets. And we can see where those groups are more likely to live at a very, very local level. And what we haven't had time to do yet is actually look at we can get the data not just for the supergroups, but for that middle layer of 25. So you can actually find the supergroup, the groups down at that very, very local level. And we can predict with some of this data the likelihood of whether they're likely to be inactive walkers or not. So we can get really quite local with some of this. And it marries up potentially with some of the stuff that Nick will share later. And it will help us get quite rich information about very local communities and what those demographic groups look like. Okay, this is inactive walkers, and you can see the trends over the years of 6 data for all of those different demographic groups. You can see the pattern of the start of the pandemic and how it pushed inactive walking up in all demographic groups, apart from, including the over 75s. All of them pushed up, all of them have bounced back to some degree, apart from, or the one that's bounced back the least, lower socioeconomic communities, NSSEC 6 to 8. NSSEC is the way that the census puts people into socioeconomic classification. NSSEC 6 to 8, if you're wondering what it is, NSSEC 6 and 7 are people in routine and semi-routine work. It's going to be more like retail, production lines, labouring, cleaners, etc. And NSSEC 8 is long-term unemployed and never worked. That will include people on disability benefits. And you can see that group, yes, it pushed it up. Look at the positive trends on all of these pre-pandemic, by the way. Then the pandemic's come along, shifted it. Most of them have bounced back to almost where they were, not far off, apart from NSSEC 6 to 8 in particular. So just getting into that group in a little bit more detail. That's the socioeconomic classifications all the way from 1 to 2 managerial professional occupations, and you can see the 6 and 7 and 8 down at that side. So it's across 6, 7 and 8. It's not, often it's 8 that can be really high and 6 and 7 can be quite a bit lower. In this case, and when it comes to inactive walkers, it's both. It's 6, 7 and 8. Okay, and this really posed a question for me, and this is how weird I am, by the way. I found myself sat in bed last night with my iPad, reading the Chief Medical Officer's recommendations from 2011. Not your normal bedtime story, if I admit it, and it did keep me awake because I was trying to find out, what do we do with work minutes? I know that minutes, Active Lives does not collect minutes of physical activity that you do at work. It doesn't ask about it. So there's no minutes in here from work or in any physical activity data from Active Lives, okay? However, in 2011, there's this really little line that says occupational activity counts. Well, that's all it says. And I'm like, well, how do I interpret that? So it's really vague. And so I checked the latest Chief Medical Officer's recommendations in 2019, and there's nothing said about work minutes. What we've got are people, the reason why I'm going down this rabbit hole with you, is 6 and 7. Those jobs, what are they more likely to be doing? Low intensity walking, because they're going to be possibly walking around shop floors. They're going to be possibly walking around building sites or spaces cleaning. Those groups are going to be more prevalent in 6 and 7 than anywhere else. And they're going to be doing low intensity plodding, for want of a better description, within work. And that is a factor that we really don't understand enough about how that then creates perceptions about trying to be active outside of work and getting walking outside of work. And it's an area that we need to get a bit stronger at. I was, again, struck by this slide. Wasn't what I was expecting. NSSEC, so this is NSSEC, our lower socioeconomic groups, broken down by a second demographic factor. Look at the groups, the 2 groups on the left-hand side. Look at the 55 to 74-year-olds, that's who I never expected up here. I don't know why. But actually, we've got a challenge with men within the lower socioeconomic communities not walking. And we've got a challenge with our younger people. I can understand the younger people a little bit. Try and avoid walking like mad, if you can. And especially in that age group, you're almost getting into that space of trying to get your hands on your first car. That kind of thing's happening, isn't it? So there's some interesting stuff going on in there. But those 2 groups, high, isn't it? That's what I was surprised by there, that's something for us to be thinking about. It's not maybe the normal groups that we would consider, but we do need to be thinking about them. Just going back to the point that I raised earlier about people that don't walk, don't do anything else. Ignore the numbers, by the way. I should have taken them off. I forgot to. They're so misleading. They're so misleading. God, I can't remember what I've done in the last 28 days, let alone exactly how many minutes. Even if I've got my watch, my phone out, I'd still be miles off. So it's not. the numbers aren't particularly useful. What's useful is the pattern. Okay, what do you see here? Well, inactive walkers basically aren't doing anything else. Or if they are doing something else, it's very, very few minutes of it. Hence why there's a lot of people that fall into the inactive group. Okay, and you can start to see with walking for leisure and walking for travel, they are getting some minutes in total, but they're not getting them through bouts of 10 minutes or more. They're doing them very short movements, you know, local shot, whatever it might be. So there's some minutes there, but not a lot. And then very unlikely to do anything else, very likely to do anything else. This is one of my favorite slides, but I am weird. So let me explain it to you. Over here, you've got the baseline data of 2015-16. And in 2015-16, we could look at this information and we could see that lower socioeconomic communities, in terms of walking for leisure, were likely to do 5 sessions of walking for leisure in the 28 days. But they were more likely to do 6 sessions of walking for travel. And the size, the depth of the block is related to the length of the session. Okay? Roughly, that has pretty much stayed the same throughout all the, it fluctuates a bit, but not massively and not statistically, in any statistically significant way. But then look what happens when we get to the pandemic. You know, so we've got 6-5, we've got 5-6, 5-6, or 5-5, then it goes up, they both go up to 6-6, but walking for travel sessions are a bit longer than walking for leisure. Then the pandemic comes along, and it shifts big time. Okay, not necessarily walking for leisure, that stays okay, but walking for travel drops. And that's where our drop and our lack of bounce back is coming from. It's losing sessions, not minutes, because the minutes haven't hardly changed. It's not the length of the session. It lost a session. And when Nick's slides come on, he's going to make us really think about why that might have happened. But we're losing walking for travel sessions amongst this group. Okay. Now, I've got a couple of slides later on about the diverse communities as well. This is what it looks like when you look at that in terms of minutes from walking for leisure. Look at how we've got a general pattern going upwards, which is positive in walking for leisure, and on the right you've got this decrease in walking for travel. In fact, it's dropping off a cliff, pretty much. It's halved. So those loss of minutes, it's halving the minutes. We've got a challenge there. If that continues, and that, we're going to either have to push walking for leisure up, we've got some things to think about. I've put these in, but Nick's got some better stuff than this, but I thought I'd keep them just to give you a sense of who people walk with. So we can break the data down and we can look at who people go for a walk with. Look at the difference in some of the ones where people are walking with others between lower socioeconomic groups, that's the darker green, and everybody else. There's some really big differences there, especially that walking with adults over 16. Our low socioeconomic communities don't go walking with other adults, which I find really quite intriguing. Why? What's going on there? And then we've also, this one I can understand a bit more, or in my head I might be making some wildly inaccurate assumptions, but I can understand it a bit more. Start and finish at home, look at the difference between lower socioeconomic, which is the darker blue, and then the lighter blue. Big difference, okay? That could be to do with where's that group more likely to live? Urban, deprived communities that are more densely populated, that are lacking green space, etc. So I can understand that one a little bit more, but the one with social element, I'm like, what's going on there? If there's anything we can bring to that picture, it'd be really helpful. Just very quickly on ethnicity. So you can see the pattern here of it improving. This is our Asian communities. Inactive walkers was improving pre-pandemic. Pandemic's come along, it's pushed it up. It's dropped back a little bit, but it's stayed up again. So a very similar pattern to our lower socioeconomic communities. And there will be quite a big crossover between Asian communities and lower socioeconomic communities. Just turning that into the pattern on minutes, you can see that walking for leisure has gone up a little bit in the latest year. The walking for travel has dropped off a cliff again, very similar to lower socioeconomic. So again, we've got a similar pattern to lower socioeconomic. A bit different when it comes to our black communities. Haven't experienced the kind of yes, there is an improvement from the first year data. The first year data might have been a bit of an outlier. I don't know if it might be sample size related, but then the next 4 years are very consistent. Very consistent. And then in the latest year of data, inactive walking group has increased. Then look at what, oh, gone the wrong way. Look at this. Found this. Look at how low the walking for leisure minutes were pre-pandemic. Then the pandemic's come along. And look at what's happened in the latest year of data. And the walking for travel has reduced, but nowhere near the same scale as it has for lower socioeconomic or for Asian communities. So there's quite a different pattern here for our black communities, which I'd be really intrigued to try and understand a bit better than I currently do. Very quickly on children and young people. The data set, obviously a different data set, it's collected in a very different way through schools. However, you can see some similar patterns in it, and there's one really, really interesting one that really got my interest. So we can only go with, well, we've only learned how to look at once a week, participation, I think it is once a week that they've walked. This is the proportion that's walked once in the last week. Okay, there are other things in the children and young people data, but minutes in the children and young people data is really hard because it's not put in by the children and young people. If you go for a walk, you're assigned like a certain number of minutes, so it's like wildly inaccurate, I would have thought. But anyway, overall, the general pattern here is walking has increased amongst children and young people. Look at the groups that are more likely to walk in the last 7 days. Girls and low family affluence. We can't use social grade questions for children and young people because they wouldn't know some of the answers. So there's a different questioning process used which puts children into low family affluence, low fast, medium fast and high fast. So we know that our low affluent family children are more likely to walk, and girls are more likely to walk as well. But that girls one is quite interesting. I'm going to come back to it in a minute. This is what it looks like from an ethnicity perspective. Look at the black and Asian and other again down the right-hand side. So there's lower levels of walking within children and young people within those communities, which kind of correlates or associates nicely with the adults. I just want to come back to girls and lower affluence family. Look at how girls' walking rates have changed since the pandemic. And I can tell you that one of the groups that's really pushed that girls up is teenage girls, years 9 to 11. This is a group that for 50 years we've been trying to shift the behaviour of in terms of encouraging this group to be more active. They are, because this is coming through in levels of activity. Teenage girls' activity levels are going up and have been going up for 2 and a bit years nationally, and it's being driven by walking. Why? Somebody told me Instagram. I'm not on Instagram, so I don't know. But apparently there's been a lot of communication on Instagram by influencers about walking, which I find really intriguing. But I think there's probably lots of other factors involved in it as well. But there is this really interesting trend there. Now, interestingly, it started just before the pandemic, actually. And the pandemic has actually pushed it up and reinforced the trend. So there's something going on which is really positive around teenage girls and walking, which we need to try and get our head around and think about how we apply it to other activities because it's really positive. And then also you've got that increase from a low family affluence perspective as well. That's me. I'm hopefully haven't gone too over time. That's a summary of it. I think we're probably best leaving any questions and do them after Nick's, because I think Nick's stuff will fill some in and pose some more questions if that's all right. Okay, thank you.